welcome to, or I guess afternoon or morning,
Whenever
whatever
you're
time
watching
you're
it.
watching this. Welcome to another episode of Truth Talk. Today is September the 25th, but we are filming midsummer. We're trying to get ahead of the game. So we're going to talk about something today that actually came out at the beginning of summer, the first week or so of June. And it would be remiss of us as a Southern Baptist church if we did not discuss in some way, form, or fashion the investigation that took place with the Southern Baptist Convention on allegations of abuse within Southern Baptist churches. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today, what our response is to that, and really why you need to have some safeguards in place to make sure that you are protecting yourself, your leaders, but also your congregants and your visitors. So we're going to start off just by talking a little bit about that report that came out, and it was a pretty disturbing report, to say the least.
Let me just put in there, because I understand what you were saying, but we want to protect the children. We want, or anyone that's being harmed. I'm not.
And it could be an adult.
Could be
if
an
somebody's
adult,
using their position of power. So that's why I say congregants or visitors.
Anyway, we do not want this happening, and if it does happen, and we want it brought to light at the earliest possible time and dealt with as quickly as possible is what the goal should be. Never should the goal be to cover up so that somebody is protected and a lawsuit isn't happening or whatever. That should never be the goal. The goal always should be to protect the innocent and to bring help to the innocent as soon as possible.
That's right. We have a responsibility.
Absolutely.
To not hide stuff away and to be open and honest and upfront about the challenges, especially something of that nature within your church community.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that I found most concerning was the number of cases and how it was hushed up by the churches.
Sure. First of all, there's a couple of levels that was a problem here, and as a denomination, we are unique in that each individual church is an autonomous church. And I heard from some of the folks that were harmed, well, they didn't want us hiding behind anonymity or that we were autonomous churches. And the problem with that is you cannot go to the Southern Baptist headquarters and say, I want y'all to make a rule and tell all these churches to do that. The surest way to get a Southern Baptist church not to do something is tell them they have to do it.
Right.
Because you can't tell from the convention level down through there is not a hierarchical system.
Right.
And that's hard for other entities to understand.
However, within some of the churches itself, it was hushed up.
There's the problem.
And that is the problem that I find with some of the big names on the report that came out are still active pastors.
Right.
Shame on the church leadership that allow of individual Southern Baptist churches that allowed this to be swept under the rug.
What I saw that disturbing, we'll talk about how that happened, but what I saw disturbing was to find a youth minister, a pastor, a music minister, catch that happening, and rather than deal with it surreptitiously or behind the scenes, fire this person, let him move to another church without telling a soul, and then that happened again at another church. That to me,
and in some cases gave letters of recommendation.
You become complicit then with what's happening.
That's right.
In my way of seeing things, you become part of the problem.
Exactly, because that is one point that is you have to make sure people understand. There is no accountability outside of individual church leadership.
And you can't hide behind autonomous churches doing that.
We are individual churches making decisions for ourselves. So therefore, you have to be able to, and that again should increase the responsibility for accountability. We're not the United Methodist Church that has a hierarchical system put in place and they kind of put pastors where they're going to be. We're not the Catholic Church where there's dioceses in charge of different areas and different churches, and so there's very much, you are an autonomous leader in your church. And so therefore there is a greater burden of responsibility that you bring things up and do not hide them away when things that rise up to this level. Now, not every, and I think we need to be careful too. An allegation is not something that automatically ought to be just blasted everywhere, but something that's got some sort of credible truth to it.
And so much of this did.
There was only very few instances where there was not enough credible information that would cause you to make a change in your church leadership.
And I know we're talking, and a lot of folks are going, What? So you can go on to the Southern Baptist webpage, or you can go on to the Georgia Baptist webpage. You can Google this and read the report. I don't recommend you read all 288 pages, but you can go to section 4, which is the meat of the report. It talks about the events and what took place, and it'll give you a pretty good idea of what the report was about and what's going on. I mean, I don't say don't read to it if you want. A lot of it, though, is just definitions and terms and how they got to where they got to, and so a lot of legal lawyer stuff. But if you want to get to the meat of the report, I believe it's section 4 is the report meat. And I think as Southern Baptists, especially if you're in leadership in any church, you should open that report up and you should read at least that section 4 and get a good idea, because you're responsible to know that and communicate it to your congregation, and to make sure nothing like that is happening in your congregation, and to set up the guidelines to make sure it does not happen anywhere around you.
I'll say it's very disappointing to see the reaction by some of these church leaders now. Even amongst all this, I was watching, and for good or evil, social media platforms are out there, but I was watching TikTok, and it was a young woman who asked to speak to the church, and she was telling, she had been through counseling, she was abused as a young adult in the church, and had witnesses that were willing to step forward and say, yes, this happened. It did happen behind closed door. It was a pastor of a church. And she was saying this happened, and she was immediately surrounded on stage by the deacons or elders, whatever they were, as almost a physical barrier it looked like to oppress her. They were standing right in front of her, but God bless her husband, who did not know her at the time this happened, stood up there with her and was physically had his hand out holding these people back from towering over her. And this happened just a couple of weeks ago at a church in the southeastern part of the United States. I don't know where. Somebody had tagged a different church, but I don't think it was the church they tagged, just because I've seen the inside of that church before and it did not look like the inside of that church. So it was a very well-known church, and that the person had tagged, and I don't want to say it because I don't know what church it was, but it was somebody in the congregation that was living it. They're like, this is happening at my church right now. And the husband said, you gave her this purity ring when she did a purity commitment here at this church, and you took her purity. And he threw it at that pastor, and he's like, we're done here, because they were coming up to challenge her. He said, no, we're done here. And I will say, and I get that you don't know that it happened, but she said she had the name of the credible witnesses. But that church sat, and I feel badly for that church, because they sat there kind of in stunned silence. They didn't know what to say, and only
probably wasn't the right way to do that, but still, you don't. What bothers me is there's no brokenness about it. A lot of this.
I will say, at the end of that clip, people said, 2 men, I heard their voices stand up, and they said, if you did it, you need to tell the truth. You need to stand up and tell the truth. If this is true, right now, we expect you to stand up and tell the truth.
Don't let it come out later.
So I thought, well, good for them. Good for them, because those deacons or elders or whomever, the pastor's son, who was an adult, came rushing the stage at her. And that's when the guy who was filming got up and moved up to, and started filming, showing people, I'm documenting this. And they kind of all backed off. And so
Yeah, this is such a difficult
it
thing
is.
because once, as we discussed before we started, once you are accused with this, it's hard to unaccuse, whether
Yeah.
you're guilty or not guilty. It is a difficult thing. So, you know,
Here you have this, in this instant, I tend to believe it because this is a grown woman now.
yeah,
And she
probably.
said it happened to her starting when she was 15.
And it's so much of it has happened, you tend to think it may have been.
And apparently they said it was apparently it was true because they said one of the people said it was a consensual relationship. And that's when the husband set up, she was 15.
Yeah,
There's no such
such
thing
thing.
as a consensual relationship with a youth person in your church that is 15 years old.
And you hear that over and over from these folks say, well, but she was consenting. But a person in power and authority, and you have a minor, there is no consensual
That's right.
situation, zero.
That's right.
Even in an adult world where you have a person in authority and power and another person that is in a lesser position, even when they say they consent, it is not a consenting situation. I mean, I don't know why folks can't get this.
Yeah, if you hold a position of authority over someone, any subjugation to that is abuse.
Yeah.
Because you hold a position of authority.
Yep.
You know, whether it's perceived by the person or actual, it is a position of authority. And abuse is abuse, and we really have got to. For me, one of the outtakes for this is that individual churches need to come up with some sort of mechanism for reporting and for investigating and for accountability.
So that brings us to the subject we need. I mean, that's a brief overview.
Yeah, and we could spend a lot of time talking about the dregs of this report, and it is dregs. If you take the time to read it, it is the worst of humanity. It really is. I mean, it doesn't go into a lot of detail like that, but it is just, for the Christian, it is disheartening.
It is. And let's hope
to read.
It is a minor,
That's right.
a small group of folks that are doing. I certainly hope so. Any is too many, though.
That's right.
Let's talk with the time we have left, or part of the time we have left, about how these things happen, and not we're talking about in the Southern Baptist and in the ministry happens out in the world. And some of these things will apply, but we're talking about this particular circumstance. One of the reasons it has happened, I think, is hero worship. We have placed some people that are in the position of power and authority so high on a pedestal, they begin to believe that anything they do is all right. Now, that's the first class. That's these large mega churches with mega pastors that have been given unlimited power, unlimited authority, unlimited finances, and without any boundaries. I mean,
no humility about it.
Yeah. And so, and I'm not casting, I don't want to cast so broad a brush to say all. I'm not saying all, I'm saying some, because that's what we saw in the report, some. And when you do that, if you have not put up, take a Billy Graham, if you haven't put up boundaries like a Billy Graham did, you're going to be pretty soon, if there's any susceptibility there, the old devil's after you, and he's going to find that spot, and you're going to find yourself in a problem.
And our flesh is weak. The Bible tells us.
I don't care who you think you are.
That's right. It doesn't matter what kind of Christian you are, how long you've been a Christian. If you have a weakness, especially if
and
you're
we all
in a
do.
position,
Every person has weaknesses.
especially if you're in a position of leadership when it comes to Christianity, the devil, we are under spiritual warfare, and he and his demons will do what they can from a spiritual warfare standpoint to use and utilize that weakness that you have, whether it could be sexual impropriety, it could be alcohol, it could be drugs, it could be
money,
finances,
yes,
anything.
Any of those things.
If you don't have a mechanism for accountability and to keep even the whisper of impropriety from happening, you're setting yourself up for failure.
And what better way to destroy the testimony and the witness than to take someone that's in a position where hundreds or maybe thousands or sometimes tens of thousands of folks are looking up to some of these folks. And if you can find a way to tarnish that person, I mean, you have hurt literally, lots of people,
right.
hundreds and thousands of folks. And so,
well, if you're a big church like that, and the reason it's so prevalent in these large churches is because there's so many people that a person disappears into the crowd. It happens in small churches too.
And we'll talk. Well, that's next.
But it is so much more prevalent in this report in these big churches because it's a single instance within congregations of thousands, not just in person but online and things like that. And like you said, we set these people. I mean, the first really. I mean, we've heard about these for years and years, but the one that really just came out of nowhere for me was Ravi Zacharias.
Yes.
And that wasn't an issue of church, but and I don't really know the truth and all behind that. There's a lot of, I know some in his family have fought very vehemently, saying that a lot of these allegations were false, and then you have these other people saying it wasn't false, and I haven't spent the time to go through the documents and to see. I know that Ravi RZIM Ministries did hire an independent investigator who said that some of the allegations were true. But even then, some of his family said they twisted some of that to have all that. So I don't want to disparage him. However, there was enough there to give the perception of impropriety. So even at that, you receive. I mean, people. I so esteemed Ravi Zacharias. He was a wonderful teacher, and now that does not take away from his salvation. I firmly believe the man was saved, but he was flawed. But we put these people up on these pedestals, and that is just, it's causing such harm to the kingdom when we do that.
Right.
The only person who belongs on the pedestal is the person who died on the cross for our sin.
And he won't ever disappoint.
That's right. That's right.
No.
So that's the problem, though, with these big mega churches and these mega industries and these mega ministries, is that there's anonymity in that whole, in the setup itself. It's so large that impropriety is easily lost within the complexity of the organization. Yep. But it happens in small churches.
Yeah, and then the small church is, again, on a different level. The pastor or the youth minister, a lot of times in the smaller churches, it may be a youth minister, can be a pastor, but they look and they start grooming these children, or mostly in those, the report showed children, and that they see weakness. It's small enough, and they see weakness, and they gravitate to that. They see that young girl that's desiring fulfillment and is not getting it somewhere, and they start giving it to that child. Male attention, extra little bits of attention here and there, and that child starts gravitating and looking for a male figure that can complete what they're not getting either at home or looking for. And then that minister, rather than giving godly advice, takes advantage of that circumstance, and then that child is involved in a relationship that the child ought not to be involved in, and the child then is so deep involved, it feels guilty. The child, it's not the word, but she feels guilty.
Or he.
Feels guilty. And of course then at some point, either the minister is found out and he moves on, or the minister is done with that relationship and is through with that child and moves on to the next one. And then here's a broken child. And unfortunately, the church has been blind to that, and we've got a lot of broken children that's happened, and we need to be aware of that and start doing a better job of overseeing the ministries of our church. And see, the problem is in our smaller churches, a lot of times, take for instance our church, I am the only staff at the church. and I'm bivocational, so I'm not full-time at the church. And so we've got volunteers that are wonderful folks here, so we are having to self-police ourselves. So it is always that challenge to be able to make sure everything is as it should be. And so we have to set up as best we can. We try to make sure there's always two people involved, a male and a female, in any youth events. So we try to put up the safeguards that's necessary to make sure things are never in a situation. So we will allow someone to get involved in that. And then I try to, and we try to look and see, is any child tending to wanting to be alone with one particular person a lot, or is one child going off to spend the night with folks they ought not to be spending the night with a lot? That type of thing. As much as I can be aware of those things, I've always tried to be aware of that type of stuff. But you can only be aware of so much.
It is very difficult, but that is why, again, why you have to set up a organizational structure. You have to set up some sort of guidelines on how you do. So, if you're a member of a church that you don't know what your guidelines are, you need to ask your church leadership, how do we, I know a lot of things I've listened to on the radio this week has been, making sure people have background checks. These things would have never come up on a background check, though, for the most part, because it was unreported, or it was happening, or it was an inappropriate sexual relationship between adults who, whether it was consenting or not, there was an abuse of authority. Some of these situations, many of them were youth pastor type situations, but it was being hushed up. So there was nothing to find if you would run a background check. So while it is a good practice to run background checks on people who are going to work with your youth, that is not going to be... That does not need to be the basis of what
you don't need to run a background check. Well, I've done my job.
That's right, because that's not enough. You always need to have at youth events. If your youth pastor is a male, you need a female present. Now, our children's ministry, like it's for us, it's mostly women, but we try to make sure that there's a couple of people, in the rooms. That way, that you don't have one adult alone with children. So you want to make sure you've got some sort of mechanism for accountability. One thing that you've always done, as long as I've been alive and you've been a pastor almost my entire life, is don't meet with someone of the opposite sex alone. You don't. That is a. I know we talked about this, and the media criticized and ridiculed former Vice President Mike Pence when he talked about not taking meetings with women without another woman present. Right. And they're like, oh, you're afraid to be alone with a woman. No, he's protecting his reputation. Right. He's protecting the reputation of the person he's meeting with. Just because you're in a business environment, now sometimes it can be more awkward when you're in a business environment but then you need to meet at a public place, where there's nothing odd able to go on, or anything. So it is up to you to guard your reputation and the reputation of others too. And so that's what you do, is you don't meet with another woman alone. You always make sure. And I've done that for my life. I have plenty of friends that I've gone to their houses or whatever, and their husbands have been there alone. I don't go to their houses when their husbands are there alone. I won't be. Now, if I can go to a single friend's house alone because we're both single, but I wouldn't go to someone who's single in a leadership house alone because I want to guard that person's reputation and my reputation. So you have to think about it. It's not just, it's, again, you want to protect yourself from the appearance of impropriety. Right. And there are logical steps to make for everyone that's in church activity to do so. We should all want to make sure, regardless of your role within the church, as a Christian, you should always want to guard your reputation, because your reputation is Christ's reputation to the world.
That's right. And it's not hard. It's common sense, really. And if I see somebody not using that common sense, my flags go up pretty quick. And if folks just run by those common sense things, I know some folks, it's just, well, I never would do anything wrong. Okay, how about that person you're with? Would they do anything wrong? And would they compromise you? And so, it's just, I've made some hard and fast rules in my life. And I've told folks, if you see me not going by those hard and fast rules, something's wrong. So we know the rules,
Right.
and the other folks know the rules, and so you can put those safeguards up, and you can make sure that they're there, they protect you, they protect them, and there's also to help keep you straight. So I've already told folks, if these are certain things I do, and if I'm doing other than that, there's a problem. There's a problem. Check me out.
Right.
So that's also something that helps me.
It's that accountability structure.
Yeah, that I've set there, because I know I'm a human being and I've got flaws and I've got weaknesses. So I've had to put up the gates, the things to keep me straight and narrow too. So I wouldn't sit here with a proud stuck out chest. So I could never be tempted. I could never have a problem. No, that's a foolish thing to say. What I do is I try to set up boundaries so that if I were tempted to do things, those boundaries keep me where I need to be. And so, and that's what we need to do in all the areas that we're talking about here.
Well, it's definitely something that churches need to, at this time, in especially Southern Baptist history, really need to take a moment to reflect and see what safeguards do we as an individual church have in place. What are our accountability measures? Do we have a reporting structure? You don't want to just you don't want to open yourself up to just having all these kind of inane accusations. There's a biblical structure for wanting to bring up any sort of offense, and Paul's very clear about how you are to do that. Again, you want witnesses, you want to do it in your church setting, and all that, but you also want to make you need that as a church in this day and age.
Yeah.
You need to have some sort of formalized plan for how you're going to receive information, how you're going to investigate, who's going to be involved in that. And so this is the time for churches to really reflect on what is their plan, and making sure that that you have a plan in place.
Because you need that person that has been harmed here. One of the reasons they don't come forward because they feel like folks will not believe them.
That's right.
And so you need to have a way that they can be believed. They feel like if they can be believed. And so they need a reporting avenue that says, we will believe you. Until you are proven wrong, we believe you first.
Right.
And I think that's a good safeguard, and that tells everybody else, we're going to believe that person first.
With a credible story.
With a credible story.
Because you do want to be careful, because sometimes there can be people looking to cause trouble.
And that,
and and that is why, there needs to be these accountability measures.
And that's easy
because those accountability measures, common sense, are going to keep yourself able to have a non-credible accusation.
But if I've done my job, if I've continued to always have someone with me when I'm with another person of the opposite sex, or when I'm counseling someone or whatever, if I've done my job and this person is trying to accuse me, I'm always going to say, let's see. And I'm going to call that person that was with me, I'm saying, time and place. And then I'm going to call my witness, which is going to be the person that I'm going to have with me, and I say, now, were you with me at this time? And tell me what was happening. So you've always got what your pattern is, how you always do things. So you've got that on your side. But now, if they start accusing me, and I say, well, I'm sorry, I didn't have somebody with me that day, then the flag goes up, and it should go up if that's the case.
Especially if that is your safeguard.
Yep.
And that's why it needs to be, to me, that's why you need to have a formal plan so that people know. Like, if you had a new person come into your church, how would they know that you don't meet with them alone?
Right.
Well, you've got a formal plan so that they know this is how we do things. Right. And so that's just, we can't stress that enough, that in this day and age, churches need to have a mechanism a formalized mechanism of how things are done,
Yep.
how we operate as a church.
Yep.
And church leadership needs to be able to understand that, needs to be able to speak to it, need to be able to explain things, need to be, and it needs, for me, I really feel like it needs to be written down somewhere within our documents. That doesn't mean it can't ever be changed, because if a new pastor were to come in and they want to do things a little differently, it's, that might need to be flexed somewhat. But there needs to be some sort of formalized way of, this is how we meet, this is how we operate. And then when something happens outside of the bounds of how we say we meet and operate, this is the path that we use for investigations and to make sure that someone who has an allegation or who has a concern is not demonized in that process.
Right.
Because that is what happened to people.
Right.
And there has been a lot of hurt and a lot of shame placed on these accusers and these abused people by the church. And that is grievous to the heart of God.
Yeah, they've been double
Yes,
hurt then.
they have. And so we as churches need to put the right things in place in order to assure that this does not happen going forward.
Agreed.
Tough week for those of us in leadership roles within the Southern Baptist Church. Again, not necessarily individually for churches, but to the reputation of our denomination, and most of all to the reputation of God and His kingdom. Because ultimately we are here to be salt and light.
Yep.
Salt preserves, and light gives life, and grows and everything.
There's a time the church needs to be focused on the gospel and doing the work of restoration, and our focus is completely off that.
That's right.
And so, and it has to be now. We have to take care of this issue, but we look at the world around us, and rather than being focused on the main issue we need to be on, we've got it on the issue that's we've caused harm ourselves.
Again, in the world, not of the world.
Yep.
We need to be focused on that which is for God's kingdom and for His glorification and edification. And if we're not, we're not fulfilling our purpose and our calling. Well, thank you for joining us today. It hasn't, I know, been the most pleasant of talks, but we would be remiss if we didn't address it at all. I think that's one of the things churches, especially smaller churches that feel a little bit away from these greater things, when you don't address them, it almost looks like by not addressing them, you're also trying to cover them up.
Yep.
So we felt it was important to address these issues and make sure that people who interact with our church through our social media means know that we are aware and that we are heartbroken for those who were hurt and who have lost a portion of their selves, really, and somehow lost relationship with the church in some instances. So we do, in some instances, so we do did not want to just completely ignore that. We will have another episode next week, and we look forward to seeing you on our next episode of Truth Talk.